What if they were more transparent? Because I don't think they are. And they emphasized how all 7 of those leaders, Brigham and John and Lorenzo and Wilford and Zina and Eliza and Bathsheba were all lying for 50 years. What if that was their primary emphasis?
So there's a lot of talk and a movement now within the church, especially online, of those that believe that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy, that this was started by Brigham Young. He made everything up. Carnal desires took over. He brought in his buddies, and then the next several prophets going with John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff and Lorenzo Snow, all were in on this deal, all in on this conspiracy that they coerced the women throughout the church to comply, to write affidavits, to write in their journals, to make statements. And it's just beyond anything that I can imagine possible even. Now, this episode is brought to you by the Wavemakers Podcaster Cruise going down the Baja in Mexico. This is November 15th through 22nd. We've got Jacob Hansen of Thoughtful Faith. We've got Cardinellis of Ward Radio. We have David Boyce of 52 Churches in 52 Weeks. Jackson and Hayden Paul of The Stick of Joseph. Jasmine Rapley and Dave Butler of Plain and Precious Things. There are going to be great presentations. We'll bring the online community face-to-face for 7 days. Go to cwicmedia.com, cwicmedia.com, up at the top at Trips and Events, and scroll down to Wavemakers and put in the promo code CWIC, CWIC5 for a 5% discount. Now back to the conspiracy. Just logically, think about this for a minute. You've got a group of people that are saying that Brigham Young brought in polygamy, that he actually made up Section 132, that he had all the other prophets coming down all the way with John Taylor, Lorenzo Snow, and Wilford Woodruff all in on this. The quorum of the 12 apostles, other leaders of the church, coerced the women. This is not just a matter of a fallen prophet or somebody with a bad idea. This is evil at its core. This would require a tyranny so strong that everybody had to shut up or else. And it just doesn't pass the test. It is not logical just on its surface. Look, there are evidences that you could say if you're pulling up, you're reading the Saints books or you're reading the Joseph Smith papers, you're looking at all the stuff that we now have access to online. I get it. But this formulation is a regurgitated argument. In fact, the same phrases, the same specifics that the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints made against the Latter-day Saints early on. These things were argued in the 19th century, and now they're coming back through again. Brigham Young is evil. Polygamy was never instituted by the Lord. And therefore, and not everyone takes it to this point, but therefore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a fallen entity. That's what the Reorganized Church was saying. In this episode, I bring back Brian Hales. We talk about the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Relief Society presidents who all stated that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. And I want to make one more comment on this. And I know this doesn't apply to everybody that supports this idea. But the inevitable end to this, I'm sorry, the inevitable end to this is that the church has fallen. That we had 50 to 60 years of apostasy, mass apostasy, and evil, coercive, tyrannical men making sure that everyone zipped their lips. That's what it requires to believe this. And if that's where you want to go with it, fine. The problem is you start to lose faith. Many people will start to lose faith over this. I can't tell you how many times, on the very few times I've ever covered the topic of polygamy, I get a sampling of individuals that can't stand Brigham Young. And I don't mean they just don't like him as a person. I mean, they call him vile things. They say that he is evil. Many that say that the church today has fallen because of this, and that after Joseph Smith, nothing really matters. We've got the Book of Mormon. We just can rely on that. We've got Joseph's teachings. We can just rely on that. I think it's a pernicious idea. I really do. And I know that's going to make people unhappy, some people. But I think it's a very pernicious idea. Let's dig into this. So, Brian, what do polygamy deniers not want you to know?
You know, the primary focus of the polygamy denialists, deniers, I don't want to be disrespectful in referring to them, but their primary focus is on the period of Joseph Smith's lifetime. And they have their own version of church history, and it only really deals with that. They don't want you to look beyond Joseph Smith's death to recognize what the rest of their narrative is telling people. Because what it does is it tells them for the next 50 plus years, the second, third, and fourth General Relief Society presidents, and the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth presidents of the church were all liars. Because every one of those men and women said that Joseph Smith had taught them about plural marriage and that he was a polygamist himself.
I think, let me interject here. I think it goes beyond that, honestly, because, lying is bad enough, right? And people say, well, they were lying for the Lord, right? I hear that phrase a lot. They're lying for the Lord. But it's worse than that, because what you're really saying, and the only way that this version of history works, is you're saying that they either forced or coerced dozens of people in their writings and in their beliefs and everything else to say, no, tell everyone, put it out publicly in court and elsewhere that, either you were a polygamous wife with Joseph Smith, or you knew that you're a witness to or that you were not that you were a wife of Joseph Smith, or that you're a witness of this. And complete coercion would have to be put into place. And then it leads also to, especially looking and focusing on Brigham Young, that this was an evil man. It was not, he had such carnal desire to sleep with several women that he was going to form the religion around this now that he was in charge, take it away from the spirits, take it away from the commandments, complete severing, if you will, from God, and then coerce all of these individuals into saying these things and lying for the Lord. That's quite a conspiracy theory.
Well, and they never want to talk about it. They allude to it, and then they quickly will move off of the topic. I could give you a couple of examples. I recently listened to a video, and it's not by one of the leading YouTubers. I'm not going to mention names, but it was called "Woe Unto You, Scribes." And at the end, she's talking about Eliza R. Snow, and she concludes with this sentence. She says, Eliza cannot be considered a credible witness. Now, that's a nice way of saying Eliza R. Snow is a liar. And then that's it. They move on. They don't tell us, was she lying about other things? What would make her want to lie? What was making her, in their version of church history, what was making Eliza R. Snow lie? And then in the other example, there's an article that's been uploaded to the internet called Crafting a Sacred Story. And this is where a lead YouTuber, denialist, and another independent scholar whose motives I can't begin to understand come together, and they try to intimate that the affidavits that Joseph S. Smith collected in 1869 really aren't accurate. And they say, quote, the affidavits may not have strictly adhered to personal recollections. In other words, they're lying to some degree, big degree, small degree, but they're kind of lying. The affidavits reveal more about the social political climate of their creation than the historical events they purport to document. So the affidavits are lying. They're intimating again in that statement. But then they go on and they say, when the women appeared to participate, meaning they signed the affidavits, and they're just appearing to participate. They really don't want to, but it says their agency was often constrained. So here we have intimation that their agency they're being coerced, they're being compelled to lie, and then they just move on. It's like, well, who's doing this compelling? And as it turns out, as you know, as you just said, the men that are doing it are the second, third, fourth, and fifth presidents of the church. Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow. And they are doing it, as you said, for motives that are probably base. Allegedly, they like sex so much or something is making them want to do this. But the saddest part, perhaps, of this whole story is that Bathsheba Smith, the fourth General Relief Society president, Zina Huntington III, and Eliza R. Snow II are portrayed as these poor, weak women who couldn't stand up for the true memory of Joseph Smith because these mean priesthood men are oppressing them. And if you study the lives of these women, and I have, and maybe you have too, but it's just a really sad story when you portray these women as weak and as liars, which is an integral part of the second half of the polygamy denialists' version of church history. The first half is Joseph was a monogamist, but the second part of it, they just want to ignore or just sidestep or, sugarcoat like they did. Well, somebody's oppressing them and they're not credible over here. I think we want to ask the polygamy denialists to be more transparent with their message. If their message is that Joseph was monogamous, okay, but if they're also telling people that for the next 50 years, the top 7 leaders of the church were liars, and that when they said Joseph personally taught them, they were eyewitnesses of Joseph Smith's polygamy, that they are lies, come clean. Let's just bring it into a full package instead of trying to keep their audience from knowing the second half. Because when somebody accepts the polygamy monogamist, Joseph Smith is a monogamous narrative, they may not even realize what else they're accepting.
And I think if you put yourself in that period, right, you're talking from 1844 to 1901, basically, almost 60 years of living under this lie. And there's no one that has come out and exposed it to, of the evil men. There's no one that's come out to expose all of this. These women that were coerced into writing these affidavits and others that were writing these affidavits or writing in their own journals or whatever it might be, that there's nobody that has said, exposed these evil men of this conspiracy and that it was all a lie for 60 years. It's such a stretch. I understand, we've got this new democratized information, scholarly information available now on church history. You go into Saints, you've got the Joseph Smith papers, you've got all of this information out there. And so you can go out and everybody can look at it and you start compiling these things and you can you start forming a narrative maybe out of all of this information. I don't think that's going to stop. And I don't think it's going to be just the polygamy deniers that end up with some of these strange ideas from all of this information, right? And creating these narratives. We're going to go through a period of time until things again become more codified and understood as lay individuals are out trying to form their own history on church history. So I get it, right? I get that to a certain degree. But once you get to the point of the immense conspiracy level, I mean, just think, putting yourself in that position, the immense conspiracy level that would be required among all of the people, all of them, that they had to have lived under for almost 60 years in pretending, that Joseph Smith started polygamy and not Brigham Young. To me, it's beyond belief. That one single point, it is beyond belief. I understand that they have some evidence. I mean, you go through Emma's words, you go through Joseph Smith's words, and of course, one of the arguments they have, it's a good argument in and of itself, right? We don't have anything in firsthand writing or statement from Joseph Smith or Emma on saying that they approved of polygamy. Great. Okay. There's something there. Put it in a court of law. That's what you're going to submit as evidence. But going beyond that into everything else, to me it's just unbelievable to me.
Well, the conspiracy aspect of it is, by my count, the number of liars in the polygamy denialist version of church history. These are individuals who left handwritten or spoken testimony is 75. Now that's quite a conspiracy, and as you mentioned a couple of times, to have a conspiracy with that many people, some of them are not members of the church, by the way, not a single one of them later spilled the beans. You know, the bigger the conspiracy, the more challenging it is to keep everybody, you know, with the same narrative. You know, it's a lie, but you want everybody lying the same way. But we don't have any of these 75 people afterwards coming forth and saying, oh, it was all Brigham. You know, we just made it up. They aren't revealing the conspiracy. Every one of these people goes to their deathbed claiming that Joseph was a polygamist. And that, when it comes to such a big conspiracy, is a remarkable finding.
So let's run through some of these Relief Society presidents as an example, and some of the things that have been quoted and said of them. Do you have that with you now, if you want to go through some of this, starting with Eliza R. Snow? Yeah.
Well, do you have that first JPEG that I sent over? If not, I can just describe it.
Yes. You're talking about the handwritten note?
Yeah. This is a fun paper that Don Bradley, I had him working for me. It was like 2008. So it's been a number of years ago. Mm-hmm. He's down looking at Andrew Jensen's papers, and he received some help from historians there. They said, Don, you need to go look at this. But Don is looking at it, and he's noticing that there is a change in the handwriting on this piece of paper. Now, what the paper is Andrew Jensen has gone around visiting Nauvoo polygamists, and he is writing down names of Joseph Smith's plural wives, and he has 13 names there. And then he interviews Eliza R. Snow. This is 1885, 86. We don't have an exact date. But Eliza R. Snow apparently took the piece of paper and her own pencil and wrote at least 13 more names. It's a little hard to discern some of them. There's at least 13 new individual names that Eliza R. Snow adds in her own hand. And the reason this is significant for the polygamy denialist is that in their narrative, Joseph was a monogamist. Anyone saying he's a polygamist is lying. And here we have Eliza R. Snow lying in a remarkably elaborate and detailed way. And most denialists think polygamy is bad. So she's not only lying, she's implicating or incriminating 13 other women as being part of the conspiracy or as doing this bad thing called polygamy. And so again, this portrays Eliza in such an elaborate liar. That's about the only way I can state it. And I would argue she wasn't a liar. She is telling the truth. She's not making up these details. But their narrative requires that she be a liar. There's no way she can be telling the truth and Joseph still be the monogamist that the polygamy deniers insist that he was.
Now, who is Andrew Jensen?
Andrew Jensen was an independent scholar at this point, but he later became an assistant church historian. He also authored the historical record. There was an 1886 article on plural marriage in there that just has a wealth of information that we still quote from to help us understand what was happening, because he interviewed all these novel polygamists. And we also have his research notes, which are invaluable as well. And this is the first list of Joseph Smith's plural wives. I think there's 3 in the collection. But the remarkable thing is that Don Bradley figured out that the bottom half there is Eliza R. Snow's handwriting. And Jill Durr, who's an expert on Eliza R. Snow, verified that this is in fact Eliza's handwriting. And so there's no question that this is Eliza writing about Joseph Smith's plural wives. But the only way to interpret that through the lens of the polygamy denialist is that this is a lie. These are lies. Lie number 1 through 13 from Eliza R. Snow, the second, General Relief Society president, the woman who wrote "Oh My Father," the words to that hymn, the one who organized a primary and did, a whole bunch of remarkable things, but she was too weak to stand up for the truth, according to the denialist. If she just stood up for the truth, she would have said Joseph was monogamous, but she said Joseph was a polygamist. So she's lying, and she's lying because she's oppressed by her priesthood leaders. And that whole narrative it's false. And it makes me sad that anyone would imply that or state that as part of their overall history.
Now, Andrew Jensen, did he make any of this public? Was he going to go out? Was he putting an article out or anything? Was he trying to put something out for public information, or was he just compiling this for himself or for the church?
Good question. And I mentioned that there was a monthly newspaper periodical that would come out called the Historical Record. First 4 volumes, I think, are in Danish or something. And then he switches to English. And he does have an article in 1886 just entitled Plural Marriage. And at the very end, he lists, I think it's 26 of Joseph Smith's plural wives there. And it came at a time when the church is being really persecuted. And after he wrote it, Wilford Woodruff wrote him a letter and says, we know you're trying to do the right thing here, but the timing is really bad. So will you stop? And Don Bradley, again, my dear friend who was researching, he theorizes that he stopped writing on plural marriage, though he had anticipated doing more. But if you look at the index to the overall volume, you see he's interjected additional details that Don thinks he had picked up for a second, article, and he's kind of slipped them into the index because he didn't want it to get lost. So, but yes, this is a very important document from Andrew Jensen, 1886.
So he's got here, he's got 25 written down here, but obviously Emma would not be in here because because she's not a plural wife, so to speak. And so
Correct.
So you've got the 25 and Emma. So based on what Andrew Jensen and Eliza R. Snow has put in here, and I don't know if she's even got all of them in here, but Joseph Smith, based on Eliza Snow, had Emma as a wife, and then 25 others.
That number 25 isn't really accurate. If you look at the other, there's a second column there, and there's more wives, I think, on his other sheets as well. But some he includes, some he doesn't, and we have additional evidence for some. I actually go through all of this in one of the last chapters of my trilogy in volume 2, and I have a big chart there showing the different papers from Andrew Jensen, which wives are included, which aren't, what the final tally is. But there were, quite a number of women who were sealed to him, and he's got most of them on there.
Yeah, you're right. I'm seeing maybe closer to 30-ish or so that are on here.
So.
Okay. So let's go beyond that. I mean, we've got some statements here. Can you go over these for us as we just go through them and talk a little bit about each one of these quotes?
Well, what I did is I went through the Women's Exponent. And Eliza R. Snow was a big proponent of getting that going in the very early days. And so I wanted to say, did the General Relief Society presidents, Eliza Snow, Zina Huntington, Bathsheba Smith, as they were serving as church General Relief Society president, did they talk about Joseph Smith as a polygamist? Okay, giving their firsthand accounts, and they all did. And what we're seeing here is just that Eliza R. Snow is saying that, and somebody's recording it, but made some excellent remarks on celestial marriage, told the large congregation that the principle of plural marriage was taught her by Joseph Smith, the prophet. That's some high-level lying if you're looking at it through the lens of the polygamy denialist. And we can read these others. If Emma Hales Smith Bideman actually said what Joseph Smith III quoted her saying about plural marriage, she died with a libel on her lips. Because Eliza knew that Emma knew, because Emma was involved. She was involved with at least 4 of the plural sealings, and Eliza was well aware of her being aware of it. And then a third one there is that it just refers to Eliza being sealed to Joseph as a plural wife. So we do have these public pronouncements from Eliza. And then if you scroll down, Zina Huntington, she's the 3rd General Relief Society president. And the first one there, the prophet Joseph was chastened before he accepted the law of celestial marriage. An angel appeared to him and threatened that God would take the priesthood from him unless he established that principle on the earth. And the principle is, of course, the plural aspect of eternal marriage. Celestial marriage is a principle from God. He commanded it and sent an angel to reveal it to the prophet Joseph. Treat it sacredly, my sisters, for the Spirit of the Lord is grieved when you speak against this principle. And you kind of wonder, Zina is warning people, don't speak against polygamy, at least as a principle and a practice. And yet, what are the denialists doing on a daily basis? The prophet knew of her faithfulness and saw by revelation when he was in the Liberty jail that Zina was to be his wife. Okay, a plural wife. Again, this is talking, and I go through this in my books if you want to read more in depth here. But it says Sister Zina became the wife of the prophet Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. So she was a plural wife. I believe it was an eternity-only non-sexual relationship, but nevertheless, she was sealed to him. And then if we can skip down to Bathsheba if you would like. She's a little more general. And if somebody wants these charts, I'm happy to share all of this material. But Bathsheba, fourth General Relief Society president, in 1886, she said she had also heard the prophet speak of plural marriage and knew that it was revealed to him. And anyway, we can go on, but you get the picture that if we're going to say Joseph was a monogamist, the rest of the history after his death needs to be part of that narrative. And that means they've got to interpret these statements through the lens of Joseph being a monogamist, which means all of these women over the pulpit as the highest women leader in the church are telling lies, deceiving their audiences. And I say that's not the right interpretation. These women were devout. They were honorable. They were hardworking. Zina Huntington went back east, and she was vice president of the National Council of Women. She's playing on a national stage back there, and she's vice president. But are we supposed to believe that she's coming back here and being oppressed to lie about Joseph? Their personalities were strong. They did great service to the church. And so I'm troubled by any narrative that would portray these women as weak or as deceivers.
Is this the only source here? I don't know enough about the visit of the angel to Joseph Smith when he was basically trying to hold back on practicing. And I mean, like anybody is scared to death of what's in front of him here. But there's, the story that the angel comes and he's got a sword and he says, look, you're going to practice this or else, pretty much. What is the background to all of that? And are there more than one sources for that?
Great question. I have an article that I wrote years ago. And at the end, I had compiled 21, and I've got 2 more from Lorenzo Snow. So there's 23 now. Different accounts from people who knew Joseph Smith. See, that's the key. I don't want secondhand accounts. These are people who knew Joseph Smith, and they related how he said that an angel with a sword had threatened him. Now, what he threatened varies. Some people said he was going to kill Joseph's son. He was going to take away his priesthood, like Zina said here. The church couldn't progress is another one of the things. But the angel threatened Joseph to go forward. And we have it from 9 individuals, at least 23 different accounts. One of those witnesses is Mary Elizabeth Rawlins. And she added some details, which are very interesting, because she said the angel came 3 times. The first time was in July of 1834. He's on Zion's camp. He's going back to try to get the saints back to their properties in Jackson County. He's 1,000 miles away from her, but he learns that she's supposed to be his plural wife. But that's when the angel first comes, which is why I think he went to Kirtland. He's been commanded to do this. And there's one account that says he thought about going to Benjamin Johnson's mom and asking her for one of her daughters. She had 3. But as it turns out, he instead asks Levi Hancock to talk to his sister, because she has a daughter, Fanny Alger. And Levi talks to his in-law, his sister and his brother-in-law, and Joseph is asking for Fanny's hand as a plural wife. And their answer is, well, it's okay with us if it's okay with her. So Fanny gets involved. See, Joseph didn't just see Fanny and fall into bed and call a ceremony kind of thing. No, this was a highly organized process according to the documents that we have. And I believe it came in response to the July 1834 angel visit, and that this probably occurred in late 1835. Don Bradley's written a wonderful article dating it after the restoration of the sealing authority, which would have made it the first sealed marriage of this dispensation. We don't know. I'm not sure what to think about that. If it was a priesthood marriage, It was just something God recognized, even if the state of Ohio did not. But it would have been a true marriage in everybody's eyes afterwards. And I don't know if you wanted to get into Fanny Alger, but afterwards it's just kind of interesting because everybody that we can document Fanny told about the relationship, they all talk about it as a plural marriage. But the people Joseph taught, they're going, no, Joseph, that was adultery. This is Emma, his wife, and all of her cowdery. They're not accepting it. But certainly Fanny thought it was a genuine marriage, as did her family and the Hancocks and the Webbs where she went to stay. So anyway, that's kind of a long story getting from the angel, but I wanted to add one more thing, that it wasn't a flaming sword. Okay, of all the 21 accounts, there's one that is supposedly quoting Eliza R. Snow saying it was a flaming sword, but it's through a non-member and it's in a New York newspaper and he's just sensationalizing. I'm very confident because we have others from Eliza. It's not a flaming sword.
Just borrowing the cherubim imagery.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Okay. All right. So then we go down a little bit further here. I want to bring this up also because this is very pertinent to what we're saying here. Let's see here. This is under Bathsheba Smith, right? But here in the second quote here in 1903, toward the end here, I'll read this. It says, did Brigham Young reveal plural marriage? Sister Smith. He did not. God revealed it through the prophet Joseph Smith. I have tried to be one with my husband, and I was just as happy with him as any woman could be, for I loved him dearly, and I knew why he practiced the principle of plural marriage. He knew it was a principle of exaltation, and I wished him to receive as great an exaltation as anyone, and I expected to share it with him. So here again, I mean, you've got a direct quote just saying, did Brigham Young reveal plural marriage? Because again, putting it into context historically, where we have here the conflict of what's going on between the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and other factions, in fact, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And everything's coming down to trying to ad hominem attacks essentially on Brigham Young primarily, and trying to create this argument of saying, look, Brigham Young started polygamy. We don't believe in polygamy. And this is one of the major factions. Even before Joseph Smith III came in 1860 to be the president of the reorganized church, you've got several individuals that had broken off, and I don't know if I say this right, but the Strangites and others that end up coming in and bringing together this body of individuals that start the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And what's so interesting to me, and I've gone back and looked myself at some of this documentation. I just did an episode on this, in fact, but is that the arguments made by the RLDS at the time, right, the reorganized church, are almost verbatim the same ones that you hear from the polygamy deniers. And so I can't help but think that as this research goes out there and Google bringing in everything out that it can that is pertinent to the phraseology and the search words and everything else, that these arguments aren't being brought in and regurgitated in our time now, because it is focused on polygamy. It's focused on Brigham Young. I show exact quotes almost from the reorganized church and their paper that they put out, and what I hear on several YouTube videos. It's almost verbatim the exact same thing. Yeah. And so it's like they're borrowing from what happened at the schism to begin the secession between Joseph Smith and Brigham Young.
But, it's also interesting because if you look at Emma and the things that we have from Emma before 1860 versus the things that are after, we have contradictory evidence. We have individuals like Joseph Coolidge and William McClellan who go and talk with her after Joseph's death, but before 1860. And they both relate how she was willing to talk about Joseph Smith and his plural marrying. We also have an account from Lavinia Smith Walker, who was her niece, Emma's niece. It was Hiram's daughter. And she also says that Emma talked with her about Joseph's plural wives. But then once we get to 1860, see, her son has built his church on two ideas: that Joseph's heir should be his son, Joseph III, and that Joseph Smith Jr. wasn't a polygamist. that's foundational for them. And so for Emma to then relate that she was aware of Joseph's polygamy, she would have been defying her own sons in a big way. And you'll notice also that most, not all, but most of the denials from Emma are filtered through RLDS missionaries or RLDS leaders. See, they are being the spokes. They're giving us Emma's words, okay, but they are words that they really need Emma to be saying at that time and place. And are they biased? Well, of course, everybody's biased, but we just have to beware about how far those biases are going. And then we have to contextualize those to Emma's words before 1860, when she freely is discussing the polygamy element with several individuals.
Yeah, I was speaking with a descendant of Joseph Smith, and and I don't know enough about this, but they were saying that, for all intents and purposes anyway, and I don't know how clear this would be, but that Joseph Smith III kind of starts to concede that Joseph Smith did practice polygamy toward the end of Joseph Smith III's life.
There's overwhelming evidence to show that Joseph Smith III knew, and it's a puzzling thing, because I like Joseph Smith III. I think he was trying to do a lot of good things. But
I think most people do, yeah.
Yeah, he went out to California and talked to Agnes Coolbrith's daughter. And I'm sorry, we have the account through the daughter, but when they went out and talked to Agnes was one of Joseph's plural wives, and he told them. And David, when he heard this from Aunt Agnes, as they called her, they were dumbfounded. David was just, I don't know if having to deal with this cognitive dissonance was part of David's overall mental challenges. I'd like to think it wasn't, but he spent his last days in an asylum. But he was there with Joseph Smith III and Alexander, his older brothers, and they heard right from Agnes that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. But then we have two letters from Joseph Smith III. Later in life, one is writing to William Smith, his uncle, Joseph's brother. And William is saying, I'm going to write a biography of Joseph. And Joseph Smith III says, okay, go ahead and do it, but there are some things you shouldn't remember. He's telling him, we've worked too hard to take away the label of polygamy to my father to have it disrupted now. I'm paraphrasing what he says. And then there's another even more revealing letter from Joseph Smith III to E.C. Brand. E.C. Brand is a missionary in Salt Lake City. And E.C. Brand apparently had been asked to get the names of all of Joseph Smith's plural wives that he could discern, because he's out here in Utah. He writes back to Joseph Smith III with a list. And then in this letter, Joseph Smith III is writing the name and then commenting on that woman, on what he knew about her. Could she have been a wife? And so he goes name by name. It's one of the sources of Joseph Smith's plural wives that we use to try to get the full list. And it's in Joseph Smith III handwriting. And so there's just no question that Joseph Smith III knew about this practice, even though his public stance was against it. So, I don't know. We don't want to judge Joseph Smith III, but there's a cognitive dissonance he's dealing with that's pretty profound.
Yeah, because again, the founders, he's not really the founder. I mean, they kind of brought him in, actually. And the founders were all very much anti-polygamist. They had gone to the Strangites and others, and then they started practicing polygamy also. So they left them and came over. So, yeah, I figured that was probably true in what they were saying. One more thing here from Bathsheba Smith that I want to put in here is your last quote that you've highlighted. Go down to what you highlighted. Sister Emma, she says, talked to us a good deal on the subject of plural wives. I believe that was as true as any principle the prophet taught. So again, you're saying, okay, well, she's lying about this. She says that it wasn't just like, oh, she mentioned something on it. She talked to us a good deal on the subject of plural wives. So you have to ignore all of these things in order to say that, not mentioning the mass conspiracy that it would require to pull all of this off. It's just such a stretch to me.
Well, the thing that we need to also emphasize here, and I really haven't mentioned it yet, is that have you ever signed an agreement online or on paper, and it's got lots of small print, but you don't read it, and then something happens and you go back and you go, oh my gosh, I just agreed to all this stuff. I didn't even realize it, and then it works against whatever you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people will hear the polygamy denialists version. And just a couple of weeks ago, there's a new video out on D&C 132, and I listened to the first part, and the presenter was masterful as a spinmeister. He had cherry picked his evidences. He went beyond the evidence when he needed to. He ignored a small mountain of evidence that contradicted it. He had speculated at the right part. If you would just listen to this narrative, you go, wow, that's pretty convincing. And so if somebody hears that, and then they hear the church's version, which is that Joseph was a polygamist, nobody likes polygamy, almost. So you say, well, I think I'm going to go with Joseph, the monogamous group. Okay. What they may not realize is when they hit that accept button in their brain or in their faith, that they are also accepting that Brigham and Zina and Eliza and John Taylor and Lorenzo and Wilford and Bathsheba were all liars for the next 50 years, and they're leading the church. It's, how does true authority, how does the prophetic mantle, make it through this period of darkness with all these leaders who are liars, and the men are oppressing the women? So they're not just lying, they're doing it with force and compelling these women, coercing.
They're evil.
Them.
There's no way around it. You cannot conclude what I've heard often is well, they're lying for the Lord, and there is a you kind of fall into a bad practice, and then it becomes a reality, and all these different things. But I mean, what is required for this to happen is pure evil. It is absolutely pure evil that has to prevail among the leaders, the quorum of the 12, the first presidency, and everybody else. It is absolute pure evil. What is happening here, if you believe that. And this is the other thing, is there's an argument that says, look, it's okay. You can have bad people as leaders. Fine. Okay. You've got a testimony of the church. You've got a testimony about a prophet leading the church. You love the church. Fine. And that's goes into a lot of the biases that you have in supporting that history, the history of the church. But again, you take all of that away. I don't care if you are a non-member, you look at church history on your own, you look at everything and you come in, you cannot get away from the logical explanation of a mass. This would be the largest conspiracy in the history of the world. It is to have hundreds of thousands of people buy in and say they're all going to be, no one's going to break out. No one's going to call somebody out on the conspiracy. Everybody's in on it. It's kind of I'm trying to think of the movie. I'll come up with that and put that in another episode. But it's beyond anything that can be logical to me. It's not just a matter of, well, there's a bunch of people that don't want it to be true. From a logical standpoint, how can you possibly stretch yourself that far to put this in place because you don't feel good about it?
Yeah, because you don't like polygamy, but
because you don't like polygamy. I get that part.
We all get that. We don't like polygamy, but let's flip the discussion. What if the polygamy denialists, instead of emphasizing that Joseph was a monogamist, what if they were more transparent? Because I don't think they are. And they emphasized how all 7 of those leaders, Brigham and John and Lorenzo and Wilford and Zina and Eliza and Bathsheba were all lying for 50 years. What if that was their primary emphasis? What would we do? We would call that an apostate message. We would call that antagonistic, anti-Mormon. But you see, it's hidden. They don't talk about it. The second part of their narrative is an apostate message. And it's important because people accept the first part. They may not even realize what they've done when they hit that accept button in their head is injected into their belief system, a faith-killing virus, if you will. Because the next time they hear about Brigham or John or something, or Eliza, they'll think, wait, those guys are liars because they said Joseph was a polygamist. You see how it undermines faith today. It's bringing people out of the church, and they don't even realize they're signing up for this narrative when they decide, oh, I like the monogamy version of Joseph better.
Yeah, and you don't know where that leads. I mean, I can't tell you how many people have messaged me on this topic, and inevitably, not inevitably, but a number of them get to the point of Brigham Young was evil, and in fact, he and others, John Taylor and others, were all involved in a conspiracy to kill Joseph Smith, and they're the ones responsible for killing Joseph Smith. And that is more prevalent than people realize if you haven't heard that before. I'm telling you, I get these messages. And it's look how look where you end up. Some of these people end up with this. It's very concerning. And comparing one of their favorite things to do is to compare Brigham Young with King Noah. I don't know where they get that. I mean, that's a very odd thing, but they love to compare Brigham Young to King Noah. And they're basically the same person.
Wow. Well, it's a spirit of apostasy. It's darkness. I think, how can we, I mean, I've had people write to me and they say, look, I've heard this stuff, but it didn't feel right. I've had 2 or 3 use those very rubes. It didn't feel right. There's a spirit to the polygamy monogamy, or to the Joseph Smith monogamy narrative. And just be careful, because make sure we realize that it's a lens that says everybody's a liar between 1844 and 1901 who's leading the church. And if that isn't speaking evil of the Lord's anointed, or if that isn't something that is going to incite an apostasy, feeling of apostasy, I don't know what else could. And for local leaders, I've heard of local leaders who they're not going to be bothered with worrying about this. But if somebody wants to believe Joseph Smith was a monogamist, they just say, okay, that's fine. What they need to do, if these people are vocal, is also ask those individuals, well, do you think that Brigham and Zina and Eliza and all of these leaders are liars? Because that brings out the feelings that they really are conveying. It takes away the veil. Yes. It brings transparency to the whole message, instead of letting just this question of Joseph Smith's polygamy prevail. We need to throw back that curtain and demand, or at least hope or invite the polygamy denialists to become clean on this part of their narrative.
Yeah, and you see that the church has seen that several people have grabbed onto this idea, because they just came out this week with a new section on plural marriage, specifically saying Brigham Young did not start polygamy. Joseph Smith started the doctrine. Right. And just trying to put things straight with people, because it's necessary. I mean, it's got to be put out there. There has to be a check on these things. And if you've done research and you've seen, I'm talking to the audience here, and you've thought about this, and wow, I wonder if this is possible. We all go through that kind of thing. We all go through levels of trying to understand something new, and things we have to put on a shelf, or things that we just aren't sure about. But I would just suggest that you look at where this leads for a lot of people, and what it requires you to believe. When you pick up one end of the stick, you pick up the other.
Yeah. I couldn't say it any better. I loved how you summarize it. So I would just encourage us all to look at the whole message that the polygamy denialists are sending, and make sure that we want to believe that the church went through this period led by liars and oppressors and weak women. And it's not true. These were strong women. And, you got to scratch your head and say, is it that bad to believe that Joseph Smith restored the practice of plural marriage for a time? He didn't want to do it. If people will study the documents, you discover that the first set of the eternal sealings, in plural sealings that he performed for himself, were all to legally married women. They were non-sexual. Okay, I hope we finally got that established, that it wasn't true polyandry. A woman can't have 2 genuine husbands on earth, but these were sealings to satisfy the angel and not to offend Emma. That's what I believe. So he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to cross that line. And then the angel came the 3rd time, and only was the sword made manifest in that third visit, we're told by Mary Elizabeth Rollins. And so the angel means business. And then after that date, and it was early in February of 1842, according to Mary Elizabeth Rollins, after that date is when Joseph is starting to be sealed to young women who aren't already married, with whom we can document sexuality with some of them. Not very many, but at least it's after that date. Okay, so Joseph's saying, okay, I guess I'm in. Okay, the Lord wants this restored. We don't understand it. Doesn't seem necessarily fair or anything that we can fully get our heads around. But God had his reasons. And is it that hard to believe Joseph would have been instructed that way? Is that more difficult than believing we have 50 plus years of liars leading the church? I don't know.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I fully agree with you on it. I hope this spreads a little bit of light for some people as well. By all means, if anybody here in this audience has a chance, go to look at Brian Hales' website. Brian, where do they go to?
Well, I have a couple. There's josephsmithspolygamy.org. And my late wife, Laura, actually put most of that together with some research that I'd done. There's also one that I was surprised to see referenced on this latest statement from the church's newsroom. It's mormonpolygamydocuments.org. And you can just go there and just see all the documents. What I did is I had spent actually quite a bit of money hiring Don Bradley to go get a lot of documents and purchasing documents from other collectors and things. And after my books were published, Fair Mormon came to me. They're now Fair, but they said, Brian, do you want to upload your stuff? We've got a place for it. And they helped me. They got it all ready. They got it all going. And then a few years later, I took it over and I'm maintaining it myself. But it was Fair Mormon who wanted to get all this stuff out there. Transparency, that's what we call it. And so it's mormonpolygamydocuments.org, and it's just a collection, but it's an index with several thousand entries in there, and you can just pull them out and see. But there's so much evidence that Joseph Smith did introduce this that for those who say he didn't, I think they're not accurate. They're spinning the data.
Yeah, appreciate that. Brian, thanks so much for your time.
Great.
And the research that you've done. Really appreciate that, offering some clarity on these things. And, we'll probably have you back. We'll see.
Yeah, I'd love to come. Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it.